You've arrived at Mr. Geronimo. Stay close, because things are about to get terrifying. I still keep the radio in a drawer in my kitchen. It does not work anymore. The battery pack corroded a long time ago, and the antenna snapped off somewhere between then and now. But I keep it, and every so often I pick it up and turn the small dial to make sure the click is still there, the mechanical sound it used to make when it was ready to receive. My wife thinks I keep it because I am sentimental about my ranch years, and I have let her think that. It is easier than explaining why I sold my rifle in the spring of the following year and never bought another one, or why I still will not drive Highway 5050 north of Cuba, New Mexico after sundown, or why I lock the storm door before the sun is fully down, even here in town where the streetlights work and the neighbors are 10 feet away on either side. The job was on a place called the Vidal outfit, about 40 miles west of Cuba, out in that empty country where the pinon and juniper give way to open range and long flat stretches of nothing. If you have driven that way, you know what I mean. If you have not, I do not know how to describe it except to say that the sky is very big out there and the land is very quiet, and the two of them press in on each other with nothing much in between. There are places on that road where you can drive for 20 minutes and not see another vehicle. There are places where your phone does not have any bars, not one, and where the only signal you can get on the truck radio is a Navajo language station out of Window Rock, coming through in and out on the AM band. That is the country I am talking about. I was 31 years old when I took that job. I had been working ranches around the state since I was 17. I grew up outside Truth or Consequences, and my father had done the same kind of work before he lost his back, and his father before him. It was not a family we ever thought too hard about. My mother said we were like the horses we worked with. We got broken to it early, and we did not question it much after that. I liked the work. I liked being outside. I liked knowing that at the end of the day I had moved a fence, or fed an animal, or fixed a pump, and that whatever I had done was still there in the morning. That was enough for me, most of the time. I took the Vidal job in the middle of October. It came to me through a man I had worked for down in Socorro County a few summers before, who called me one Sunday afternoon and said he had a friend who needed a hand for the winter. The friend was named Reuben Vidal, and he was in his late 70s, and his wife had passed in the spring. He owned a place out near a small dot on the map called Regina, though Regina itself was mostly a gas station and a church and a few trailers by that point. The ranch had been in his family for 4 generations. His son lived in Rio Rancho and did not want anything to do with the operation. His daughter lived in Denver and had not been back in years. Reuben had been running the place alone since his wife died, and he had fallen off a stock trailer in September and cracked 2 ribs and something in his hip, and his son had put his foot down and moved him into a spare bedroom until the spring. He needed somebody to sit on the place through the winter, feed the few animals that were left, keep the pipes from freezing, run off anybody who came sniffing around. That was it. Room, board, and a check every 2 weeks, plus whatever I could shoot in my off hours if I wanted the meat. I said yes on the phone. I drove up the next Saturday. I remember the drive very clearly. I had my old Ford, a 1994 F-150 with a manual transmission and a bench seat, and I had it packed with about everything I owned. My clothes, my tools, a hard case with my rifle in it, a Remington 702 Ford, 270 Winchester that I had bought used in my 20s, and a shotgun, a Mossberg pump that had been my father's, 2 duffels, a cardboard box of books, a cooler in the bed with some groceries in it, not much else. I have never owned much. It fit in the truck with room left over. The road out to the Vidal place ran off 550 onto a paved county road, then onto a graded gravel road, then onto 2 ruts through the brush that Reuben's family had been driving for 100 years. I passed a mailbox at the county road turn with the name Vidal on it in faded stick-on letters, and I passed a locked gate on the graded road with the same name burned into a wooden sign. And then the ruts wound down through a shallow arroyo and up onto a bench of higher ground where the house sat. Reuben was waiting for me on the porch when I pulled in a canvas coat and a wool cap, standing with his weight on one leg like it hurt to stand at all. He was thin. He had a face like a piece of leather that had been left in the sun for 80 years. He shook my hand and looked me over and said I looked like my father, which surprised me because I did not know he had known my father. It turned out he had bought a bull from him in 1982. That was the kind of country it was. Everybody had bought a bull from somebody's father at some point. He walked me through the place that first afternoon. The house was a low adobe with a pitched tin roof and a wraparound porch that had settled unevenly, so the boards ran downhill on the west side. It had 4 rooms, a kitchen with a wood stove and a propane range, a front room with a couch and 2 chairs and a bookshelf, a bedroom in the back, a bathroom with a clawfoot tub that had been there since before Reuben was born. The plumbing was on a well and a pressure tank. The lights were on a diesel generator that sat in a small shed behind the house and needed to be run for a few hours in the morning and a few hours in the evening if you wanted power, and needed to be shut down in between if you wanted the diesel to last through the winter. There was propane for the range and for the water heater in a tank you had to walk out to and check. There was firewood stacked against the north wall of the shed under a tarp, enough to get me most of the way through December, and Reuben said his neighbor to the west would bring me another cord in January if I ran short. The neighbor's name was Alcario Trujillo. He lived 7 miles away on the other side of a piece of federal grazing land. Reuben said Alcario was the closest human being to the property in any direction. There was a family named Padilla, about 12 miles east, on the way back to 50/50, and there was the church and the gas station at Regina, about 20 miles south. And past that you were talking about Cuba, 40 miles out. That was the neighborhood. The animals were not many. 6 horses in a corral behind the house, 3 of them old and 2 of them green, and one that Reuben said was mine to use for the winter. A 15-year-old bay gelding named Chico, with a gentle mouth and a slow walk. There were about 40 head of cattle scattered across the 2 sections of deeded land, most of which had already been brought in close for the winter and would need to be fed hay every morning. There was a barn cat named Peaches, orange and half wild, who came and went through a gap under the kitchen door and was fed 1 scoop of dry food a day on the porch. That was it. Reuben had sold off most of the herd 2 years before, when his wife got sick. He said he had never had the heart to build it back up. The last thing he showed me, before he handed me the keys and got in the passenger seat of his son's pickup and let his son drive him back to town, was the ranch gate. It was a heavy pipe gate on the 2 ruts, about a quarter mile up from the house. It was chained and padlocked. Reuben gave me the key on a loop of green baling twine and told me to keep it in the house at night. He said sometimes people came off the county road drunk or lost, looking to poach a deer or camp on the land, and he did not want them driving down to the house, especially not with me alone up there. He said if anybody came to the gate and wanted in, I was to walk up in the daylight and talk to them through the pipe and not open it unless I was sure of who they were. He said this in the same tone he had used to tell me about the propane tank and the generator, and I nodded at him the same way, and I did not think anything more of it at the time. Then he shook my hand again and told me he was grateful, and his son drove him away, and I stood on the porch and watched the plume of pale dust move up the ruts and disappear beyond the bench, and I listened to the engine fade, and then I was alone. I want to describe the quiet on that place, because it is important later, and because it is a kind of quiet that people who have not been out there sometimes do not believe in. It was not silent. It was never silent. There was the wind, first of all. There is always wind in that part of the state, moving over the sage and the juniper and making a low, dry rush that sounds like breath if you listen to it long enough. There were the horses stamping in the corral, and the sound of the cattle down in the flat, and the sound of Peaches walking on the porch boards with her small, careful feet. There was the generator when I ran it, chugging away in the shed. There were ravens all the time, muttering and croaking to each other in the pinyons, and there were coyotes at night, sometimes far off, sometimes close enough to hear the individual voices in the pack. There were owls, there were the small ticks and creaks of the old house cooling in the evenings. There were mice in the walls. But under all of that, there was a bigger quiet, the kind you can only get in a place where there is no highway noise for 40 miles in any direction, and no aircraft overhead most days, and no other houses close enough to hear a dog bark or a truck door slam. It was a quiet that had weight to it. You could stand on the porch at 10 o'clock at night with the generator off and the stars very close, and hear your own blood in your ears. You could hear the propane hiss in the water heater from 30 feet away. You could hear a beetle move in the woodpile. I liked it, at first. I have always liked being alone. I told myself I had lucked into a good winter. The first week was uneventful. I got into a routine. I got up before dawn, made coffee on the propane range, ate 2 eggs from a carton I kept in the cooler on the porch, pulled on my boots and my coat, and went out to feed the horses. Then I saddled Chico and rode down to the flat and threw hay off the trailer to the cattle, one bale to a group, moving slowly so I could count heads. Then I rode back and put Chico up and got in the truck and drove the two ruts up to the gate to check that the chain was still in place, because Reuben had asked me to do that every morning. Then I came back to the house and split wood for a while, or fixed a piece of fence, or worked on the tack in the barn, or read on the porch if it was warm enough, which some days it still was in October. In the evenings I made supper and ate at the kitchen table, with a book propped open against the salt shaker, and I ran the generator until 9, and then I killed it and sat in the front room by the wood stove with a kerosene lantern until I got tired, and I went to bed. That was my life for about 6 weeks. I want to tell you about the radio now, because it is going to matter. The radio was in a leather case in the front room, on top of the bookshelf, and Reuben had shown it to me on the first day. It was a Motorola handheld, one of the old ones, olive green with a coiled cord for the microphone and a stubby antenna and a dial on top for the channel and a knob on the side for the volume. It ran on a battery pack that clipped into the bottom, and there was a charger for it on the shelf that plugged into the wall when the generator was on. Reuben said it had been his father's. It was, he thought, from the late 1960s or early 70s. He said it still worked, and that Alcario Trujillo had one just like it out at his place, and that the two of them had used them for years to talk back and forth in bad weather when the phone lines went down. He said the channel was set already, and I should not touch the dial. He said if I needed anything I could reach Alcario on it most evenings between 6 and 7, when Alcario made a habit of leaving his own set on while he cooked supper. He said Alcario was a light sleeper too, and if I needed him in the middle of the night I could call and he might hear it. He said if the truck would not start, or if I got hurt, or if I needed a doctor, the radio was faster than driving 20 miles to Regina to find a signal for the phone. He showed me how to press the button on the side of the microphone to talk, and how to let it go to listen, and how to say my call sign, which was Vidal 1, and how Alcario's was Trujillo 1, and how to say over when I was done talking, and out when I was done with the whole conversation. He said I should call Alcario on my second night out at the place, so I would know how the radio sounded, and Alcario would know my voice. He made me repeat the call signs back to him twice before he was satisfied. I did what he said. My second night I turned the generator on early, plugged the radio in for an hour to top off the battery pack, and then unplugged it and carried it out to the porch and pressed the button on the microphone. I said, Trujillo 1, this is Vidal 1, over. I felt a little silly. It was like being a child playing with a walkie-talkie. There was a hiss of static, and then a voice came back. It was an old man's voice, dry and calm. Vidal 1, this is Trujillo 1. Read you loud and clear, over. I said, just checking in. Reuben told me to make sure you had my voice, over. Trujillo 1 said, I got it. You keep the set on channel and give me a holler if you need something. I am here most nights, over. I said, I appreciate it, over. Trujillo 1 said, take care of that old man's place, out. That was the first time I heard Alcario Trujillo's voice. I would talk to him 3 or 4 more times over the next 6 weeks. He asked me once about the weather up my way. He asked me another time if I had seen a red heifer of his that had wandered off, and I said I had not, and he said thanks and to keep an eye out. He told me once that a nephew of his was going to bring a load of firewood over sometime before Christmas, and to expect him. That was the extent of it. I liked hearing his voice on the radio. It made the place feel less empty in a way I did not think much about at the time. The rest of October passed without anything worth telling. November did too. I saw one hunter come to the gate on a Saturday morning in the middle of November, and I walked up and talked to him through the pipe, and he asked if he could hunt on the property, and I told him no, and he said all right and left. I saw a Border Patrol vehicle pass on the county road one afternoon, way off in the distance, its dust plume long and thin against the sky. I saw 2 vehicles that I did not recognize drive past the mailbox on the county road at different times, both of them slow, both of them at midday, and both of them were probably nothing. That was all the human contact I had that was not on the radio. The animals were what I paid attention to. There was a big cottonwood down in the arroyo behind the house where a great horned owl lived. I would see him at dusk sometimes, sitting on a low branch, watching me. There was a group of mule deer that came up to the salt block behind the barn about twice a week. There was a bobcat I saw once, at the edge of the pinyons on the west side of the property, moving low and quick and gone before I could really look at him. There were coyotes at night, always, and there were ravens all day. In the last week of November, something changed with the coyotes. I want to be careful how I say this, because it is the first thing that happened that I noticed, and because at the time it did not seem like anything at all. It only seems like anything in hindsight, and hindsight is not always to be trusted. For the first 6 weeks I was at the place, I heard coyotes almost every night. Sometimes they were down in the flat, sometimes they were up on the mesa to the north, sometimes they were across the arroyo. They yipped and howled and carried on the way coyotes do. It was normal. It was, in fact, one of the things I liked about the place. If you have not slept in that country, you might not know that a pack of coyotes calling in the middle of the night from a mile away is a sound that can put you to sleep instead of waking you up, if you are used to it. It is a homey sound. It says that the world is going on as it should. In the last week of November, the coyotes went quiet. They did not go quiet all at once. It happened over 3 or 4 nights. The first night I noticed, I woke up at about 2 in the morning to use the bathroom, and I stood by the window afterward and realized I had not heard anything. No coyotes, no owl, nothing but the wind. I thought that was strange, but not strange enough to matter. Wildlife has quiet nights. I went back to bed. The next night, I sat up on the porch until 11 with a cup of coffee, and I did not hear a single yip. The night after that, I did not hear a single yip either. The night after that, I walked out to the corral to check on the horses at about 10, and they were all standing up against the north rail with their heads high and their ears forward, and none of them was moving. Chico saw me and made a low sound in his throat, and I put my hand on his neck, and his neck was hard and stiff with tension. He was not sweating, but he was as tight as if he had been ridden hard. The other horses were the same. I stood with them for a while and looked out into the murk to the north, in the direction they were all looking, and I did not see anything, and I did not hear anything, and after 10 or 15 minutes I told myself it was probably a mountain lion somewhere up the mesa, or a bear, though bears should have been denning by then. I went inside and got my rifle out of its case and loaded it and set it against the wall by the front door. I did not think much of it. When you work with livestock, you have a rifle by the door. That was the first thing. The second thing was the tracks. The next morning, which was a Thursday, I went out to feed the horses at first light. It had snowed a little in the night, not much, maybe half an inch, just enough to dust the ground and the tops of the fence posts. I threw hay to the horses, and then I got the truck out and drove up to the gate to check the chain, the way I did every morning. The gate was fine, the chain was fine, the padlock was fine. But in the snow around the gate, on the outside of it, on the county road side, there were tracks. I got out of the truck and looked at them. The truck was still running. It was cold, maybe 20 degrees, and my breath was coming out in a white cloud, and I stood there with the driver's door open and looked at the tracks in the snow. They were bare feet. I want to be plain about what I mean. They were the marks of a human being's bare feet, or something very close to bare feet, in the snow. 2 of them side by side, right up against the outside of the gate, as if someone had walked up to the gate and stood there with their toes almost touching the bottom pipe, and had looked through, and had then turned around and walked back the way they had come. The tracks came from the direction of the county road, along the 2 ruts, and they went back the same way. They were about the size of a large man's foot. I could see the ball of the foot and the heel, and I could see 5 toes on each print. There was no boot mark, no shoe mark, nothing but skin. I stood there for a long time, looking at those tracks. My first thought was that I was seeing them wrong. My second thought was that somebody had come up the road drunk in the night and had lost their boots somehow. My third thought was that maybe it was a hunter playing some kind of joke. None of those thoughts felt right, but I made myself pick one and go with it, because the alternative was to stand there in the cold speculating about it, and I had work to do. I got back in the truck and drove up the ruts a little further, following the tracks, to see where they went. They went out to the graded road and stopped at the edge of the gravel. I could not tell if they had come from up the road or down the road, because the wind had already scoured the gravel clean. I turned the truck around and drove back to the house. I sat at the kitchen table and drank a second cup of coffee and thought about it. 20 degrees, bare feet, half a mile from the county road at the least, and more than that if the person had walked in from any real distance. The nearest place a person could have come from on foot was the Padilla Ranch, 12 miles east, and no sane person walks 12 miles in the snow with no shoes. The nearest place a person could have driven from and parked and then walked would have been somewhere on the graded road, but I had not heard a vehicle in the night. I would have heard it. On a still night out there, you can hear a truck 5 miles away if the wind is right. I told myself it was probably kids. I told myself somebody had probably driven up in the late afternoon when I was inside working and had parked their vehicle on the graded road and had taken their boots off as some kind of dare or prank and had walked down to my gate and back. I told myself the tracks were probably not as fresh as they looked, and the wind had covered up the vehicle sound, and there was some ordinary explanation. I told myself all of that, and then I put my coat back on and went out and got my rifle from beside the door and put it in the back of the truck for the rest of the day, and I did the rest of my work with the rifle in the truck. That evening I called Alcario Trujillo on the radio. I said, "Trujillo 1, this is Vidal 1, over." He came back in a few seconds, the way he always did. "Vidal 1, rearview, over." I said, "Do you have anybody walking around up your way at night? Over." There was a pause. Then he said, "No. Why? Over." I said, "I had somebody walk up to my gate in the night. Left tracks, over." He said, "Vehicle tracks, over." I said, "No. Foot tracks, over." There was a longer pause. I remember it. I remember it because Alcario Trujillo was a very steady man on the radio, and he was not a man to leave dead air, and there were maybe 5 seconds of nothing there, 5 seconds of the small hiss of the open channel, before he said, "Just foot, over." I said, "Just foot, bare feet, over." Another pause. He said, "You call the county, over." I said, "No, I did not think it was worth it. Just wanted to know if you had seen anybody, over." He said, "No, I have not. You keep that gate locked, over." I said, "I will, over." He said, "You keep the radio on tonight, over." I said, "I will, over." He said, "Out." I sat on the porch for a while with the radio in my lap and thought about the way he had said that. Alcario had never once told me to keep the radio on. It had always been understood between us that we would check in when we needed to, and otherwise we left each other alone. He had been on that country for 70 years. He knew what he was talking about. I did not like the way he had said it, but I told myself I was reading into things. I put the radio on the shelf and went to bed. I put the rifle by the bed instead of by the door. I slept. The next morning there were no new tracks at the gate. The morning after that there were no new tracks either. I checked every morning. I made it part of my routine. Feed the horses, feed the cows, check the gate, look for tracks. Nothing. I got through the first week of December that way. The weather turned cold, nights in the teens, days in the 30s. There was a little snow on and off, never much. I fed the animals. I kept the generator running. I read at night. I did not talk to Alcario on the radio again for 4 days, and then he called me one evening and asked how I was, and I said fine, and he said good, and that was all we said. But I could tell he was checking on me. I want to tell you about a small thing that happened around then, because it may or may not have anything to do with anything else, and because I still think about it. It was a Sunday, the first Sunday of December, and I had driven the truck out to Regina to buy some groceries and gas up. Regina was a 20-mile drive, most of it slow. The gas station was one of those old ones with 2 pumps and a little store attached, run by a family named Sanchez, who lived in a double-wide next to the building. The store had a hand-lettered sign in the window that said "Gracias por su negocio," and a cooler of tamales next to the register and shelves of the basic things a person out that far would need. Bread, coffee, batteries, motor oil, a small selection of ammunition behind the counter. I bought bread and coffee and a can of chili and a couple of cans of beans and a package of tortillas and a 2-pack of D batteries for a flashlight, and I paid Mrs. Sanchez at the register. She was a small round woman in her 60s who wore her hair in a braid down her back and who had never, in the 3 times I had been in the store, said more than 5 words to me. She rang me up in silence and took my cash and gave me my change, and I said thank you, and I turned to go. She said, "You are at Reuben's place." I stopped and turned back. I said, "Yes, ma'am. He hired me for the winter." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "You be careful up there." I said, "I always am." She said, "No, you be careful." She said it the second time slowly, in a way that made it clear she meant something specific, though she did not tell me what. Then she looked past me at another customer coming in the door, and she smiled at him, and the moment was over. I went out to the truck and put my groceries in the cab, and I sat there for a minute with my hands on the steering wheel. Mrs. Sanchez had lived on that country for a long time. Everybody in that country had lived on that country for a long time. If she said to be careful, she meant something. I thought about going back in and asking her what she meant, but the store was busy for a Sunday, and I knew she would not say anything in front of the other customers, so I drove back to the ranch. That was the first Sunday of December. The next week was when the radio started doing things. The first time it happened, it was a Wednesday night. I had run the generator until 9 and then killed it, and I was sitting in the front room with a lantern reading a paperback western that had been on the shelf when I got there. It was somewhere around 10 o'clock. The wood stove was going. The wind was up a little outside, moving the piñons behind the house, making that soft rushing sound. I had the radio on the shelf, plugged into the wall so that when the generator ran the next morning the battery would top off. I had gotten in the habit of leaving it on the channel, with the volume down low, just in case Alcario needed to reach me. The speaker clicked. I remember looking up from my book at the sound. It was the small click you get when somebody keys their microphone and then does not say anything and then unkeys it. A quick open and close of the channel. It sounded like Alcario picking up his set to say something and then thinking better of it. I waited. Nothing came through. After about a minute, I got up and went to the shelf and turned the volume up. I listened for a while, nothing but the hiss of the open channel. I keyed my own microphone and said, "Trujillo 1, this is Vidal 1, did you call? Over." I let go and listened. Nothing. I tried again. Vidal 1 to Trujillo 1, over. Nothing. I stood there for a while with the radio in my hand, and then I put it back on the shelf and turned the volume back down and went back to my book. I told myself Alcario had probably keyed the mic by accident, or maybe somebody else was using the same channel somewhere in the county. It was an open channel. Anybody with the right radio could listen in or key up. It was not impossible that some rancher 40 miles away had picked up his own old handheld and pressed the button and then set it down. About 20 minutes later, the speaker clicked again. This time it was a longer click, 2 seconds, maybe 3. Just the open channel, no voice, no static burst, just somebody holding the button down and then letting go. I sat there and looked at the radio and did not go over to it. I do not know why. I just sat and looked at it. Then it clicked a third time, and this time a voice came through. The voice said, "Hello." That was all, one word, just hello. It was a man's voice. It was not Alcario. Alcario had a specific voice, dry and low, and this was not that voice. This was a lighter voice, younger sounding, and it had a flatness to it that I did not like. It was the voice of a person saying a word they had learned to say but did not fully understand. That is the best way I can describe it. I got up and went to the shelf and picked up the microphone and pressed the button and said, "This is Vidal 1. Who is this? Over." I let go and listened. Nothing. I said it again. "This is Vidal 1. Identify yourself. Over." Nothing. I stood there with the microphone in my hand for a long time, waiting. My back was to the front door. I remember that. I remember standing there with the radio in my hand and thinking, without wanting to think it, that the front door was behind me. I turned around and looked at it. It was locked. The bolt was thrown. The lantern light was reflecting off the small window in the top half of the door, and I could see my own reflection in it, standing in the front room with the radio in my hand, looking back at myself. I put the microphone down. I went and got the rifle from the bedroom and brought it into the front room and sat down in the chair by the wood stove with the rifle across my lap. I did not read anymore. I sat there and listened. The radio did not click again that night. Around midnight I got up and went to bed with the rifle beside the bed, and I slept in fits until morning. The next day I called Alcario. I said, "Trujillo 1, this is Vidal 1, over." He came back. "Vidal 1, over." I said, "Did you key your set last night around 10, over?" He said, "No, over." I said, "Somebody was on the channel, said hello, would not identify, over." He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "You know how far this channel goes, over?" I said, "Not exactly, over." He said, "Not far, line of sight, maybe 15 miles on a good day, in that country, less, over." I said, "All right, over." he said. Anybody on that channel is close. Over. I did not say anything. He said, I will come by tomorrow. Over. I said, you do not have to do that. Over. He said, I will come by tomorrow. Out. Alcario came by the next day, around noon. He drove up in an old blue Chevy pickup with a dog in the bed, a black and white heeler with one blue eye and one brown, and he parked in front of the house and got out slow. He was a small man, wiry, in his mid-70s, with a mustache that was more white than black by then, and he wore a wool shirt and a canvas coat and a straw hat with a stained sweatband. He shook my hand and looked me over the way Reuben had. He said hello to Peaches the cat, who came out from under the porch to look at him. Then he said, show me the gate. I drove him up in his truck. The heeler stayed in the bed and did not make a sound. Alcario got out at the gate and walked around it slowly, looking at the ground. There was no snow by then, and the ground was hard, and there were no tracks visible. He walked out along the ruts a little, and then he came back, and he stood at the gate with his hands in his coat pockets and looked out at the graded road. He said, nothing today. I said, no, nothing since that first morning. He said, you told me bare feet. I said, yes. He said, big. I said, yes, bigger than mine, not much, a little. He said, you still got the tracks. I said, no. It thawed and refroze. They are gone. He nodded. He stood there for a while longer, looking at the graded road. Then he said, you know Reuben. I said, not really, my father did. He said, Reuben lost his first wife on this place, not the wife who died in the spring. His first wife, in 1968. She got lost in a snowstorm coming back from the mailbox. They found her 4 days later, out past the west fence. I said, I did not know that. He said, nobody talks about it. Reuben will not either. It happened. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, some places carry things. I said, meaning what? He looked at me. He had very light brown eyes, almost yellow in that light. He said, meaning some places carry things. That is all I mean. I said, all right. He said, you keep that radio on. You keep that rifle by the door. You do not open the gate for anybody after dark. You do not walk out at night. If something calls you out at night, you do not go. I said, something like what? He said, anything, anybody, you do not go. I said, all right. He said, you feel like you need to leave. You leave. Reuben would understand. I would understand. There is no shame in leaving. This is not your family land. You do not owe it what you would owe your own. I did not know what to say to that. I said, all right. He said, you call me, any hour, you call me. I said, I will. He got back in his truck. He looked at me through the driver's window for a moment, and I remember his face was in the shadow of the brim of his hat, and I could not read it. Then he drove away, and the heeler in the bed watched me all the way down the ruts, its one blue eye and one brown eye fixed on me, until the truck went around the bend. I stood at the gate for a while after he left. Then I drove back to the house. I thought about calling Reuben's son that afternoon, and telling him I wanted out. I thought about it seriously. I had money saved. I could have driven back to Truth or Consequences and stayed with my sister for a while until I found something else. Nobody would have blamed me. Nobody would have known either, because the only person who would have known was Alcario, and he had already told me it was all right to leave. But I did not call. I told myself Alcario was old and superstitious. I told myself a stranger had walked up to the gate one night in bare feet as some kind of prank or accident, and somebody else had keyed a microphone on an open channel, and those were the only two things that had happened, and they were probably not even connected. I told myself I could handle a winter alone on a ranch. I had done it before, not on this ranch, but on others. I told myself I was a grown man, and I had a rifle, and a truck, and a radio, and I was fine. I made supper. I ran the generator. I read. I went to bed. That was the end of that Thursday. Friday was quiet. Saturday was quiet. On Sunday I went into Regina again for groceries, and Mrs. Sanchez was not there, and a younger woman I did not know was working the register, and I bought what I needed, and left without talking to anyone. On the way back I saw a coyote standing in the middle of the graded road, about 2 miles from the house, and it did not move when I came around the bend. I stopped the truck about 30 feet from it. It stood there looking at the truck. It was a big coyote, healthy, its winter coat thick, and it did not seem afraid at all. It looked at me for a long time, and then it turned and trotted off into the sage, and I watched it go until it disappeared. That was strange. Coyotes do not stand in the middle of a road when a truck comes around a bend. They run. Sunday night, the radio clicked again. I was ready for it this time, in the sense that I had been half expecting it every night. I was in the front room. I had the rifle on the couch beside me. The lantern was lit. It was around 11. Click. I did not get up. I looked at the radio on the shelf and I did not get up. Click. Then a voice. It said, Vidal 1. That was my call sign. Nobody used my call sign but Alcario. Nobody else even knew it. And this was not Alcario's voice. It was the same voice as before. The flat, light voice. Man's voice. Wrong somehow. I cannot describe wrong any better than that. It said, Vidal 1. Come in. I sat there. It said, Vidal 1. Come in, please. The please was what got me. It was the way it said please. It was said the way you would say a word that you had heard other people say when they wanted something and that you had decided to use because you had noticed it worked. There was nothing polite in it. It was a word placed in a sentence because the word usually went there. I sat there for a long time. The voice did not come again. Around midnight, I got up and turned the volume all the way down and went to bed. Brojuks, bruken Feynman Sempen, Nissi still be my nanny and gi. Monday morning I called Alcario. I told him what had happened. I told him about the voice using my call sign. He was quiet on the other end for a while. Then he said, Nobody knows your call sign but me and Reuben. I said, I know. He said, Reuben would not have told anybody. I said, I know. He said, You want me to come out? I said, No, there is nothing to see. He said, You want to come stay at my place? I said, No, I appreciate it. I am all right. He said, You have thought about leaving? I said, Yes. He said, You should think about it more. I said, I will. He said, Vidal 1, out. That was the way he ended it. He used my call sign like it was a name, like he was saying my name and not a designation. I remember that. I did not leave. I do not have a good reason. I had told myself I would think about it, and I had thought about it, and I had decided to stay through Christmas, at least, and see how I felt about it in the new year. That is what I told myself. Looking back, I think I was already not thinking straight. I think a person alone on a place like that, hearing what I was hearing, can begin to lose the thread of what is reasonable and what is not, without knowing they are losing it. That may be part of the story, too. The rest of that week is where things began to run together for me. There was a night I went out to the corral around 10 because I heard the horses moving. Chico was up against the north rail again, and the other horses were bunched around him, and they all had their heads up. I stood at the rail with the rifle and looked out into the murk. There was no moon. There was starlight, but not much of it because there were clouds moving in. I could see the black shape of the piñons on the far side of the arroyo. I could see the pale line of the ruts going up toward the gate. That was all I could see. I stood there for a long time, and I did not see anything move. But at one point, and I am telling this the way it happened, at one point I heard something that sounded like a cow calling. It was not a normal cow sound. It was a cow sound that was coming from the wrong direction, from up on the mesa to the north, where there were no cows, and it was too long, held out too long, the way a person imitating a cow might do it if they had heard a cow but did not know exactly how the sound was supposed to end. It went on for maybe 4 seconds, and it stopped. Chico shifted against the rail. His hoof knocked the wood. I stood there with the rifle in my hands and my back to the barn, and I waited. Nothing else came. After a while I went inside and got in bed with the rifle beside me, and I lay awake until dawn. There was a morning I went out to check the gate, and there were no tracks, but the padlock was on the chain the wrong way around. I always closed the padlock so that the keyhole faced out, toward the county road, so that if I had to open it in a hurry with cold hands I could get the key in without looking. That morning the keyhole was facing in, toward the house. I stood there and looked at it. It could have been that I had done it that way the previous morning without noticing. I do that sometimes. Anybody does. But I did not think I had done it that way. I thought I remembered closing it the usual way the morning before. The chain was still locked. The gate was still closed. Nothing had gone through it, but the lock was facing the wrong direction, and I stood there in the cold for a long time thinking about it. I turned the lock so the keyhole faced out again. I got back in the truck. I drove down to the house. There was an afternoon around then, I think Wednesday, when I was splitting wood behind the house, and I heard a voice call my name from the direction of the arroyo. Not my call sign, my name, my given name. I stopped with the maul in my hands, and I turned toward the arroyo, and I listened. I did not hear it again. I stood there for a minute, and then I called back, "Hello." Nobody answered. I set the maul down and picked up the rifle, which by then I was carrying whenever I was outside, and I walked over to the edge of the arroyo and looked down. There was nobody down there. There was nothing but cottonwoods and the small dry watercourse and a raven sitting on a low branch looking up at me. I told myself I had imagined it. I told myself the wind in the pinyons can sound like a lot of things. I told myself I was tired. All of that was true. All of that was also not really an explanation for what I had heard, because I had heard my name, clearly, in a man's voice, from the direction of the arroyo, and there had been no wind at that moment. It had been a still afternoon, but I told myself the story I could tell myself, and I went back to splitting wood, and I kept the rifle within arm's reach. There was a night that week, I do not remember which one, when I dreamed that I was standing at the front door of the house and looking out through the small window at the top of the door, and there was a person standing on the porch about 6 feet away, facing me, and I could see the person's outline against the sky, but I could not see their face. In the dream I could not move, I could only look, and in the dream the person raised their hand and pointed at the door handle, and I understood that they wanted me to open the door. I woke up. It was a dream. It was not real. But I lay in bed afterward and I could hear the wood of the front porch creak once and then be quiet, the way old wood creaks when it is settling in the cold, and I did not sleep again that night. You may say I was cracking up. I have thought about that. I have thought about it often. I was alone, I was cold, I was not sleeping well, I was reading too much and thinking too much, and I had let the story of the bare feet in the snow get inside my head. It is possible that some of what I have described was me. It is possible I was hearing things in the wind that were not there, and I was imagining a lock had been turned when it had not, and I was dreaming things that felt real. I do not deny any of that, but I know what happened that Friday. That is the part I cannot explain. Gif, 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 gif. The Friday I want to tell you about was the second Friday in December. I know that because it was 3 days before I was going to drive down to Truth or Consequences for the weekend to see my sister and her kids, and I had already told Alcario I would be gone Monday through Wednesday, and he had agreed to come by and feed the horses for me. It was on my calendar in the kitchen. I remember looking at the calendar that morning and seeing the little box for Monday circled and thinking, 3 more days. I remember that. The day was cold and gray. The clouds had been low since Wednesday, and there was a smell of snow in the air, but no snow yet. The wind was small. The temperature at noon was in the mid-20s. I fed the horses and rode down to the flat and fed the cattle and rode back and put Chico up. I drove up to the gate and it was fine. I came back and split wood for a couple of hours. I ate a can of beans and a heel of bread for lunch. I worked on a piece of tack in the barn all afternoon, an old bridle whose cheek piece had cracked, and I did a decent job of it, and when I looked up from the workbench it was already getting dim outside. I want to tell you what dim means out there in December. It means that the sun goes behind the mesa to the west at about 4:30 in the afternoon, and by 5 the sky over the ranch is the color of an old bruise, and by 5:30 you are lighting the lanterns. By 6 it is night. There is no long twilight. The land goes from day to gloom to night in about 90 minutes, and that is that. I put the bridle away and went inside. I stoked the wood stove. I started the generator and let it run to top off the radio battery pack and heat the water heater for a shower later. I put a pot of chili on the range to warm up. I sat down at the kitchen table with the paperback I had been reading. I was probably reading for 20 minutes when the radio clicked. I sat still and listened. Just one click, no voice. Then, maybe a minute later, another click. Then Alcario's voice came through the speaker, clear as anything. He said, "Vidal 1. This is Trujillo 1. Over." I got up and went to the shelf and picked up the microphone and pressed the button. I said, "Trujillo 1. Vidal 1. Over." Alcario said, "You all right up there? Over." I said, "Yes. Why? Over." There was a pause. Then Alcario said, "Just checking. Been thinking about you. Over." I said, "I am all right. Getting ready for supper. Over. Alcario said, "You keep the radio on. Over." I said, "I will. Over." He said, "Out." I put the microphone down and stood there for a second looking at the radio. Alcario had never once called me just to check in. In all the time I had been there, every call had been about something specific. He never wasted airtime. It was not his way. But I told myself he was worried about me, and he had reason to be, and he had made a special call to make sure I was all right, and that was a decent thing to do. I put another log in the stove and I went back to my chili and my book. About an hour later, and this would have put the time at around 7 in the evening, I heard a vehicle. I heard it a long way off. I have said that in that country you can hear a truck 5 miles away in the right conditions. That night was one of those nights. The wind was almost nothing, the air was very cold and very still, and I heard, from the direction of the county road, the small distant sound of an engine. It got closer. I listened. It sounded like a pickup, or maybe a small SUV, coming up the graded road toward the ruts that led to the ranch. I put my book down. I sat at the table and listened. The engine slowed. The engine stopped. I got up and went to the front window and looked out. I could not see the graded road from the front window. I could not see anything but the near piñons and the corner of the barn. I went to the porch. I stepped out. I stood on the porch and listened. Nothing, not even a door slamming. The engine had stopped, and after that there was nothing. Just the far small sounds of the horses in the corral, and the wind moving through the tops of the piñons, and my own breath. I stood on the porch for maybe 5 minutes. Nothing else came. No engine again. No voice. No movement I could see. I told myself somebody had pulled off the graded road to piss, or somebody had broken down and would come walking down the ruts in a minute to ask for help, or somebody had gotten lost and had stopped to look at a map. There were reasons for a vehicle to stop out there and go quiet. Not many, but some. I went back inside. I got the rifle from beside the door and I checked the magazine and I put it back. I turned the volume on the radio up. I sat down at the table. 10 minutes went by. 15. The radio clicked. I looked up. A voice came through. It was not Alcario's voice. It was not the flat, wrong voice from before either. It was a different voice this time. It was a woman's voice. She sounded upset. She sounded tired and cold and upset. She said, "Hello, hello, is anyone there? Hello." I sat still. She said, "Please, please, if anyone can hear this. I am broken down at a gate. There is a gate. I need help, please." I looked at the radio. I did not move. She said, "My phone does not work. Please, I am cold. Please, can anyone hear me?" I sat there for a long time and looked at the radio. Here is what I thought in that moment. I thought a person broken down at my gate would not have a radio. A person broken down at my gate would have a phone, and if the phone did not work, they would either wait in their vehicle with the heat on, or they would start walking, or they would honk the horn. They would not have a two-way radio tuned to the exact channel Alcario Trujillo and I used, that only Alcario and Ruben and I knew the channel for. They would not know to press the button and speak. They would not sound the way this woman sounded, which was upset in a way that was slightly wrong. The way a person acts upset in a movie when they have been told to act upset but do not know why the character is upset. That is what I thought. I thought that. But I also thought, what if I am wrong? What if somebody had bought an old Motorola at a yard sale and it happened to be on this channel and they were broken down on my county road and they were a real person and they were scared and cold, and if I did not answer they would die in their vehicle in a snowstorm because I was too paranoid to key the microphone. That thought was also there. That thought had weight to it. I picked up the microphone. I did not press the button. I held it. The woman said, "Please, please, somebody. My headlights are dying. Please." I pressed the button. I said, "This is Vidal 1. Where are you? Over." There was a pause. The pause was too long. Then the woman said, "I am at the gate, the wooden gate, with the letters." I said, "Which letters? Over." She said, "The letters that spell the name." I said, "What name? Over." She said, "The name on the gate." I let go of the button. I sat there. I said, "What name? Over." She said, "The name." I set the microphone down. I did not turn the radio off. I got up and I picked up the rifle and I checked the bolt and I racked around into the chamber and I checked the safety and I set it against the wall by the door. I put on my coat. I put on my gloves. I put my key ring in my pocket. I put my headlamp on my head. I stood by the door and I thought about it. I want you to understand what I was thinking. I was thinking that a person could be at the gate in trouble. I was thinking that if that were true, I could not sit in the house and let them die. I was thinking that I would drive up to the gate in the truck, with the rifle in the cab, and I would leave the truck running, and I would look at whatever was up there through the pipe of the gate before I opened anything, and if it was a real person in a real vehicle, I would help them, and if it was not, I would get back in the truck and drive back to the house and lock the door. That was my plan. I went outside. The night was very still. There were no stars. The clouds had come in all the way. There was that dead cold smell of coming snow. I got in the truck and started it. I let it warm up for a minute. I put it in gear. Before I put it in gear, though, I heard something. I heard it clearly. It came from up the ruts, from the direction of the gate. It was a voice. It was a man's voice. He was calling out. He was calling my name. Not my call sign. My name. My given name. First and last. He was calling it the way a person would call for a lost dog, in a big open voice, from what sounded like a long way away. It carried through the still air the way sound carries at night when the ground is frozen. He called it again. I sat in the truck with my hand on the shifter. The truck was running. My breath was fogging up the inside of the windshield in slow puffs. The headlights were on, and they lit up the two ruts going up toward the bench, and I could see maybe 50 feet of the ruts before they went over a small rise and disappeared into the greater gloom. He called my name a third time. Then he said, "Come up here, open the gate." His voice was clear. It was a normal voice. It did not sound like the wrong voice from before. It sounded like a man in a canvas coat calling from a stalled truck at a locked gate, wanting somebody to come help him. It sounded like a man I might have met at a bar in Cuba. It was that ordinary. But he knew my name, and he was standing at the gate, and I had just been on the radio with a woman who was standing at the same gate, and she had not known the name on the gate. And there had been an engine sound but no door, and no headlights in the distance, and no walking figure coming down the ruts. I sat there and I looked at the ruts and I thought. I took my hand off the shifter. I turned off the headlights. I sat in the driver's seat in the pitch of the truck cab and I looked up the ruts, and now that the headlights were off, my eyes began to adjust, and I could see the shape of the piñons on either side of the ruts, and I could see the pale strip of the ruts themselves against the ground. And I could see at the top of the rise, where the ruts went over and out of sight, a thing that I want to describe to you carefully because it is the thing I remember most clearly out of all of it. At the top of the rise, right at the edge of where the ruts went over, there was a piñon. It was a piñon I knew. I had walked past it 100 times. It was maybe 15 feet tall, which is a big piñon in that country, and its lower branches came down almost to the ground, and it had a lean to it, a slight tilt to the north, and it was a piñon. Standing next to that piñon, mostly behind it, mostly hidden by its lower branches, was the shape of a person. I could see enough of the shape to know it was a person. I could see part of a shoulder. I could see part of the top of a head. The head was above the top of the piñon's lower branches, which put it, if the person was standing on the ground at the level of the ruts, at about 7 feet tall. I could not see a face. I could see part of a jaw, maybe, if I strained. It was the wrong shape to be a jaw. It was too long, or it was tilted at the wrong angle, or my eyes were making things out of shadows. I could not tell. The shape did not move. The man's voice called out again from up there. He said, "Come on, get up here. It is cold. Open the gate." The voice sounded like it was coming from a man standing right out in the ruts. It did not sound like it was coming from behind the piñon. It sounded like it was coming from a normal person standing normally at a normal gate. But the shape behind the piñon was where the voice was coming from. It had to be. There was nobody else up there. There was no vehicle. There were no headlights. There was no other person. And the shape behind the piñon was not moving. Not the shoulder. Not the part of the head I could see. Nothing. It was the stillness of something that was not breathing the way a person breathes. The voice called out again. It said, "Do not just sit there. Come open the gate. It is me. It is me." I did not know who me was. He did not say a name. He said it is me the way you would say it to your wife or your brother or an old friend, expecting them to know your voice, expecting the recognition to come to you, which is what most people would do. You would hear it and think, "Oh, that is so-and-so," and you would go, because it was a person you knew. The problem was that I did not know anyone out there. I did not have any old friends within 200 miles. I did not have any family within 150. Alcario was 7 miles west on the other side of federal land. Ruben was in a bedroom in Rio Rancho with a cracked hip. Mrs. Sanchez was 20 miles south. There was nobody else who could be at my gate saying it is me. There was no me it could be. I sat in the truck. The shape behind the pinion did not move. The man's voice said, "You are a real piece of work, you know that. Get up here. My truck is dead. I am freezing. I have got the jumper cables. Just open the damn gate." The voice was frustrated now. It sounded like a normal man's normal frustration. It sounded like a man in a bar telling his buddy to hurry up. It was a very good voice. But the shape did not move. The mouth did not move, because there was no mouth I could see, because there was no face I could see, because the head was above the branches and the branches were between me and the head. I sat in the truck and I thought. I want to tell you what I thought. I thought, if this is a man, why is he not walking down? If the gate is locked and he needs me to come up with the key, why is he standing off to the side of the ruts behind a pinon in the freezing cold instead of standing right at the gate where I could see him in my headlights? Any real man would be right at the gate. He would be right up against the pipe, waving both arms, so I could see him from 100 yards off. He would not be off in the trees. I thought, if there is a broken down vehicle up there, why can I not see any dead headlights, any dome light, any dashboard glow? There is nothing lit up on that graded road for miles in either direction. I would see even a dying headlight from where I sat. I saw nothing. I thought, the woman on the radio. She said the gate. She did not know the name on the gate. She was upset in the wrong way. She was not real. I thought, the man at the tree line. He knows my name. Nobody up here knows my name, except Alcario, and Alcario is on his own place, and Alcario's voice is not this voice. I thought, do not go up there. I did not want to go up there. But I also did not want to sit in the truck with the truck running and the exhaust puffing out the back and the doors unlocked and my head visible through the windshield. I felt very visible in the truck. I felt like a thing that had come out of its den and stood in the open and was being watched from behind a pinon by something that had been waiting for it. I locked the driver's door. I locked the passenger door. I turned off the ignition. I sat in the dead truck with the keys in my hand. The man's voice called out again. It said, "Hey, hey, do not do that." That was a strange thing to say. Do not do what? I had turned off the truck. He would not have been able to hear the engine stop at that distance from behind a pinon if he was a real man. But if he was watching me, if he could see the shape of the truck in the ruts the way I could see the shape of him behind the tree, if he could see the small movement of my hand turning the key, then he might have said, "Do not do that." He said, "Come on, I need you to come open this gate. It is cold up here." I sat still. He said, "It is me. It is me. You know it is me." I did not know it was him. It was not him. There was no him. There had never been a him. There had been an engine sound, and a voice on a radio, and a shape by a tree, and now there was a voice in the ruts calling out things that were designed to make me get out of the truck and walk up there. That is what was happening. I understood it, sitting in the truck. I understood it the way you understand a thing at the last second before you fall off a ladder, without words, all at once. I put the keys back in the ignition. I started the truck. The engine caught. The dash lights came on. The headlights came on and lit up the ruts again, and lit up the pinon at the top of the rise, and I looked, and the shape was still there, and now that the headlights were on, the shape was drawn back further behind the pinon than it had been. It had moved. It had moved when the headlights came on. It had drawn itself in behind the trunk and the low branches, so that I could see less of it than I had seen a minute before. That is what it had done. It had not come forward. A real man would have come forward, into the headlights, waving his arms. It had gone back. I put the truck in reverse. I backed away from the house. I turned the wheel, and I got the truck pointed back down the 2 ruts, in the opposite direction from the gate. I put the truck in first gear. I let out the clutch. Behind me, the voice at the gate started shouting. It was still calling my name. It was still calling it in that ordinary man's voice, but now it was calling it faster and louder. And there was something in the sound of it, an edge, that was not quite right. It was as if the person, or the thing doing the calling, had run out of the voice it had been using, and was starting to run out of practice with it. The name was said too fast, and then too slow, and then in a way that put the accents on the wrong syllables. It was still my name. It was starting to be my name being said wrong. I did not look back at the gate. I drove down the 2 ruts, away from the house, along the arroyo, toward a spot about half a mile past the house where the ruts crossed a fence line and joined an old 2-track that Reuben had said led out to the west, eventually, all the way to a cattle guard on a different piece of the graded road. I had never driven it. I did not know its condition. I did not know if it was passable. I did not know how it would take me all the way around and back to the county road. I did not care. I was going away from the gate. That was what I cared about. The 2-track was rough. The truck bucked and slid on the frozen ground. My headlights lit up sage and juniper and the pale bones of a few old cattle skulls off in the brush that had been there for who knows how long. The wind was picking up now, a small, dry, cold wind coming down from the mesa. Snow began to come down in small, hard flakes that clicked against the windshield. I looked in the rearview mirror once, when I was about a mile from the house. I saw, in the mirror, in the reflected pool of my own taillights, something at the edge of the 2-track behind me, maybe 40 yards back, moving in the same direction I was going. It was a shape at the edge of the sage. It was moving on 2 legs. It was moving faster than a man moves. It was matching my speed. The truck was doing maybe 15 miles an hour on the rough track, and the shape at the edge of the sage was staying with me, easily, moving in a way I did not want to look at any longer. And I put my eyes back on the track in front of me, and I pressed the gas harder. I do not know how long the shape stayed with me. I did not look back again. I drove. The 2-track wound around a small hill and dropped into a shallow draw and came up the other side and crossed a cattle guard I did not know was there, and the tires banged over the pipes of the cattle guard, and the truck was on graded gravel again, and there was a fence beside me that had not been there before, and I was somewhere else, somewhere off the Vidal place. I did not stop. I drove. I found the graded road, or I found some road, and I turned in the direction I thought was south, and I drove. I passed a small dark house I did not recognize, no lights on. I passed a stock tank with a windmill turning slow. I passed a Y in the road, and I went right, and I do not know why I went right, and it turned out to be the correct choice. The road hit pavement after another 20 minutes, and the pavement was the county road, and I recognized where I was, and I turned south, and I drove. I got to 550 at about 10:30 at night. I stopped at the intersection with the truck idling, and I sat there for a full minute with my forehead against the top of the steering wheel, and I breathed. Then I turned south on 550, and I drove to Cuba, and I pulled into the parking lot of a truck stop there, and I parked under the lights, and I got out. And I walked into the store and bought a coffee and a candy bar with a hand that was shaking, and the clerk asked me if I was all right. And I said I was fine, and I bought a room at the motel next to the truck stop, and I slept. Or I lay in the bed with the light on, until the sun came up. Etc. In the morning I called El Carrio. I used the payphone at the truck stop. I did not want to call from my cell phone. I do not know why. I just did not. I told him what had happened. I told him about the woman on the radio, and about the man at the gate calling my name, and about the shape behind the piñon, and about the shape at the edge of the sage in the mirror. I told him I had left the ranch. I told him I was in Cuba. He was quiet for a long time on the phone. Then he said, "You did the right thing." I said, "What was it?" He said, "I am not going to give it a name. Some things do not want to be named. Giving them names makes them come closer." I said, "All right." He said, "You are not going back there." I said, "No." He said, "I will go up. I will get the horses to my place. I will feed the cows. I will call Reuben's son and tell him what has happened." I said, "You should not go up there alone." He said, "I know that country better than it knows itself. I will go in the day. I will not be there at night." I said, "All right." He said, "You leave your things." I said, "I have got most of them in the truck." He said, "What is up there?" I said, "Some clothes, some books, my father's shotgun. That is about it." He was quiet. Then he said, "I will bring the shotgun when I come. I will meet you in Cuba tomorrow." I said, "I appreciate it." He said, "One more thing." I said, "Yes." He said, "You did not open the gate." I said, "No." He said, "That is the only reason you are on this phone right now. You understand that?" I said, "I think I do." He said, "Understand it better than you think you do. Some places, once you open a gate, you cannot close it again. You did not open it, so it did not come in. You went out the back. That is why you are here. I said, all right. He said, you keep your rifle loaded until you get back to your town. You do not stop between here and there, except in a lit place. You do not open the door to your motel room for anyone. You do not answer the phone in the room. You get to your town and you stay in your town. I said, all right. He said, I will see you tomorrow. He hung up. I met him in Cuba the next afternoon at a diner on the main street. He came in the same canvas coat and the same straw hat, and he had the black and white healer with him, tied up in the bed of the Chevy. He brought me my father's shotgun in a soft case. He brought me my 2 duffels. He brought me my box of books. He brought me the leather case with the Motorola in it. He said he thought I should take the radio. I said, why? It is not mine. He said, it has your voice on it now. Better that you have it than that it stay up there. I did not know what he meant by that. I did not ask. We ate a meal together, green chili stew and coffee. He told me the horses had been fine. He told me the cattle had been fine. He told me the padlock on the gate had been closed the way I always closed it, keyhole out. He told me there had been no tracks at the gate that morning. He told me he had walked around the pinon at the top of the rise, and there had been no tracks there either. He said the ground was very hard, and it was possible there would not have been tracks anyway. He said he had felt nothing up there that morning. He said the place felt normal. He said sometimes a place feels normal after a thing has gone, because the thing has moved on, and sometimes a place feels normal because the thing is waiting for you to come back and drop your guard. He said he did not know which one this was, and I should not come back to find out. I said I would not. He said, Reuben will understand. I said, I know he will. He said, do not tell him what happened. I said, I will not. He said, tell him your mother got sick. I said, all right. He said, you call me if you want to talk about it, but do not talk about it in your house. Do not talk about it on the phone in your house. Go outside to talk about it. Do you understand? I said, no. He said, you do not have to understand. Just do it. I said, all right. He finished his coffee. He stood up. He put his hat back on. He put a $20 bill on the table for his share of the meal and mine, and he would not let me refuse it. He shook my hand. He said, you go home now. You go all the way home before you stop again. I said, I will. He said, Vidal 1, out. He walked out of the diner. I watched him get in the blue Chevy and drive away, the healer standing in the bed with its ears up, watching me through the window of the diner until the truck went around the corner and was gone. I drove south to Truth or Consequences that afternoon. I did not stop until I got there. My sister took one look at me when I came in the door and did not ask me anything. She fed me. She made up the couch for me. I stayed with her for a month. I did not go back to ranch work for a long time. I went back to it eventually, but I would not take a job that had me alone on a place at night. Not ever. I worked on bigger outfits after that, where there were always 4 or 5 other hands on the property, and I liked it that way. I sold my rifle in April. I gave the shotgun back to my father, who had not asked for it, and he took it without a word and put it in his gun cabinet and never asked me why. I told my wife, when I met her, some of what had happened. Not all of it. Not the part about the voice using my name and the wrong syllables. I have never told anyone that part until now. Reuben passed the next fall. His son sold the ranch to a big outfit that wanted the grazing rights. I do not know what happened to the horses. I hope Alcario got Chico. I have thought about writing to ask, but Alcario passed too, in 2017, and I do not know his family, and I have let it be. I have looked things up over the years. I have read about that country, and I have read about the stories people out there tell, and I have read enough to know that there is a word for what I might have been looking at behind that pinon, in the language of the people who have lived on that land for a long time. I am not going to say the word. Alcario was right about that, and I do not have any business saying it either way. It is not my word to say. I do not know if the thing I heard and saw was that thing, or if it was something else that just used some of the same tricks. I do not know if it was anything at all, in the way we usually mean the word thing. I have thought about it for many years, and I have not come to a conclusion. What I know is this. I know that on a night in December on a piece of land 40 miles west of Cuba, New Mexico, something stood behind a pinon at the top of a rise and called out my name in a voice that was almost right, and asked me to open a gate. I know that if I had opened it, I do not think I would be here to write this down. I know that I got in my truck and drove out the back way and did not look back except once, and that the once was enough. I know I still have the radio in a drawer in my kitchen, and I know why I keep it, even if I have never said the reason out loud. The reason is this. About 2 years after I left the ranch, I had a dream, and in the dream I was standing on the porch of that house again, and the radio was in my hand, and the radio clicked, and a voice came out of the speaker, and the voice said my name. I woke up. I lay in bed for a while. I got up. I went into the kitchen. I opened the drawer. The radio was in the drawer, the way it always was. The battery pack was long dead. The antenna was long broken. The channel dial was turned to the channel Alcario and I had used. I do not remember turning it there. I had not touched the radio in a year at least. My wife had not touched it. There was no one else in the house. I turned the dial to a different channel. I closed the drawer. I went back to bed. I check it now and then. It has stayed on the channel I turned it to. It has not moved. But I check it. I keep checking it. And that, I think, is why I keep it in the drawer. Not because I am sentimental. Because as long as I know where it is, I know where it is. And as long as I know where it is, I know it is not somewhere else. That is the story. That is what happened to me in December of that year, out on the Vidal place, about 40 miles west of Cuba, New Mexico. Take from it what you want. I have taken from it what I can. I have hunted the Upper Peninsula of Michigan every November since I was 12 years old. That is 31 Novembers in a row, not counting the year my father passed and I could not bring myself to go up, and the year my daughter was born the week before opening day. Everyone in my family hunts. My grandfather worked a logging outfit north of Kenton in the 50s, and my father took his first buck off the same 2-track my grandfather used to drive a skidder down. When I was a kid, I thought that was just how the world worked. You grew up, you went north in the fall, you shot a deer, you came home, and you ate venison until March. I live in Grand Rapids now. I work as a millwright at a plant that makes industrial pumps, and I have been there 22 years. My wife teaches 3rd grade. Our daughter is grown and lives in Chicago with a husband and a small brown dog. My life is not particularly interesting, and I like it that way. I get up at 5, I drink coffee out of the same red thermos I have had since 2004, and I go to work. On the weekends in summer I fish for smallmouth. In September I bow hunt around home. In November I go north. That is the shape of my year, and it has been the shape of my year for a very long time. The place I go is not really a place anymore. It used to be a logging camp. My grandfather worked out of it, and after the outfit shut down in the early 60s, the building sat empty for a while, and then most of them fell in. There is one cabin still standing, and there is a bunk shack that leans a little worse every year, and there is the concrete pad where the cook shack used to be, and that is about it. The land technically belongs to a paper company now, but they leave it alone, and there is a handshake understanding with the local warden that as long as we do not tear anything up, we can use the cabin for hunting. My father repaired the roof in 1988. I replaced the wood stove in 2011. It is not much of a cabin. 2 bunks, a stove, a table, a propane lantern, a shelf with old paperbacks from the 70s that nobody has read since the men who left them there died. But it is quiet, and it is far enough from town that you cannot hear anything you did not bring with you. To get there, you take us 41 north out of Marquette, then west on M28 through Michigan and 3 Lakes and Nestoria, and past Kenton you turn off onto a county road that used to be paved and is not really paved anymore. From that county road you turn onto a forest road that is gravel for about 3 miles, and then you turn onto an old logging 2-track that runs east for another 5 miles through second-growth hardwoods and pine plantation and cut-over swamp. The last mile is bad. The last mile has ruts a foot deep in places, and there is a low spot where a creek cuts across the road, and if it has been wet you can bury a truck in there without trying very hard. I drive a 2017 Ford F-150. 4-wheel drive, a decent lift, a set of Cooper Discoverer tires that were still pretty good that November. I know the road. I know where to stay left, and where to gun it, and where to crawl. I have driven that road at least 100 times. Wade was supposed to come with me that year. Wade Kimball. I have known Wade since we were kids in Cadillac, and he has hunted the camp with me for the last 19 years. He is a machinist by trade, retired now, and he is the closest thing I have to a brother. 10 days before I was supposed to leave, Wade called me and told me his wife Marlene had been diagnosed with something in her pancreas, and he was not going to be able to come north that year, and he was sorry. I told him not to be sorry. I told him to take care of Marlene and I would kill a deer for him. He was quiet for a while and then he said, "Do me a favor and do not go up there alone." I laughed and told him I had been going up there alone plenty of times before he ever came, and he said, "I know, but do me a favor." I told him I would think about it. That was the truth. I did think about it. I thought about calling my cousin Randy, who lives outside Escanaba, and would have come in a heartbeat. But Randy had just had a knee replaced in August, and I did not want to be dragging him through timber. I thought about skipping the year. I did not skip the year. I never skip the year. The trip itself is a ritual. I pack the same way every time, and I leave the same way, and I stop at the same places along the way. I lay everything out in the garage the Wednesday before. My rifle is a Remington 700 in 30-06 that my father gave me for my 16th birthday. It has a Leupold VX3 on it that I put on in the early 90s, and I have never seen a reason to change it. I clean it, I check the scope. I put 20 rounds of 165 grain Federal in the ammo bag, along with the loaded magazine and one already in the chamber only when I am ready to hunt. I lay out my orange bibs and my orange coat and my wool base layers and my sorrel boots and my spare wool socks. I lay out the Coleman propane lantern and the 2 green 1-pound propane bottles and the 4 extras in the bin. I check the batteries in my headlamp and in my backup headlamp and in the little streamlight I keep on my belt. I check my Garmin GPS Map 66. I check the Motorola handheld VHF that Wade and I use when we split up in the timber. I load 6 trail cameras, 4 Brownings and 2 older Bushnells, and I make sure they all have fresh sets of Energizer lithium AAs in them. I put my knife and my sharpening steel and my folding saw and the drag rope and the game bags and a spare tarp in a plastic tote. I put 4 gallons of water in the truck and a case of bottled water and a cooler with sandwiches and hard salami and cheese and eggs. I put a coffee can with about 100 wooden matches in it because the wood stove will not always start with a lighter when it is cold. I put my rifle in a soft case behind the back seat. I put the ammo in the console. I put my orange coat on the passenger seat so I do not have to dig for it when I get to the camp. The dash camera was Wade's idea, not exactly, but almost. 2 years before, I hit a deer on US 131 coming home from a fishing trip. I hit it hard enough that it caved in the front bumper and cracked the grill and put the radiator into the fan, and I was 6 hours getting home because I had to have the truck towed to a shop in Cadillac. The insurance company gave me the runaround for a while, and I ended up eating a portion of the deductible I should not have had to eat, and Wade told me the next time I bought a truck I should put a dash cam in it. When I bought the F-150 the next spring, I bought a Viofo A129 Duo, one of the ones with the second camera that mounts on the rear window and records what is behind you. I wired it into the fuse box, and it runs whenever the truck is running, and it dumps its files onto a 256 gigabyte SD card that overwrites the oldest footage when it fills up. I forget about it, mostly. It is the kind of thing that only comes to mind when you need it. It has a little red LED on the front that blinks slow, and I stopped noticing that months ago. I left home on the Wednesday before opening day, Wednesday the 12th, or thereabouts. My wife walked me to the truck and told me to shoot straight and drive safe, in that order, which is what she always says. I told her I would call her from Marquette. I stopped in Cadillac for gas and a coffee. I stopped in Grayling and used the bathroom at the Speedway. I got up over the bridge around 1 in the afternoon, and I stopped at the visitor center on the north side, because I always do. There is a woman who works there, or there used to be, an older lady named Rose, and I have known her, in the way you know somebody you see once a year for 2 minutes, since 1998. She asked me where I was headed. I told her Ottawa National Forest. She said, "You be careful up there. It snowed pretty good last week." I told her I would. I got back in the truck. The drive from the bridge to Marquette is not a short drive. It is one of the drives where you have time to think, and where the thinking gets a little strange after a while, because you are alone in a cab, and the radio only picks up 2 stations for most of it. I called my wife from a pull-off outside Marquette. I told her I had made good time. She said the weather up there looked bad on Sunday. I told her I would be off the road by Sunday. She told me she loved me. I told her I loved her too. I told her Wade had told me not to go up there alone. She was quiet for a second, and then she said, "Wade is not wrong." I told her Wade worries. She said, "So do I." I told her I would call from the camp when I got there, if I had a signal, which I usually did not, but sometimes I did if the weather was right. She said, "Call when you can." She hung up. I stopped in Marquette at a Major for a bag of ice and a fresh loaf of bread. I stopped in Ishpeming for gas because the gas in Kenton was 50 cents more a gallon and I was cheap. I turned off onto M28 around 3:30. The light was already going. In November up there, the light starts to go at 3, and by 5 it is pretty well finished, and by 6 you have got to have a lamp on. I made Kenton around 5. Kenton is not really a town. It is a bar, a couple of houses, a store that sells bait and coffee and shells, and the old railroad grade. I stopped at the store because I always stop at the store. The man behind the counter is named Perry, and I have known him since he took over from his father in about 2005. I bought a bag of ice, which I did not need, out of habit, and a Snickers bar. Perry asked me if I was going out to the old camp. I said yes. Perry said, "You seen anybody else headed that way?" I said no. He said, "There was a fella through here Sunday morning asking about the road, said he was going to hunt the state land north of the camp." I did not think anything of that. Nothing about it seemed strange. There are always people hunting the state land. Perry said he had a camper on a Chevy, an older camper, one of the low ones. I said, "All right." Perry said, "You take care." I told him I would. I put the ice in the cooler. I got back in the truck. The county road out of Kenton is a road I have driven so many times I could probably drive it in my sleep, and I probably almost have. The pavement runs out about 2 miles east of town and turns into gravel. There are a couple of hunting camps set back from the road along the first mile of gravel, and after that it is just timber. That night it was already getting toward 6 by the time I turned off onto the forest road. The sky was low and gray, and the wind was pushing through the top of the trees. There was old snow on the ground, maybe 2 inches, patchy, more of it on the north side of the road than the south, and I could see fresh tire tracks on the gravel where somebody had gone in and come back out again. I did not think anything of that either. It is the middle of November. People are scouting. The 2-track was the way it usually is. Bad in the low spots, worse than usual in a couple of places because it had been a wet fall. I had to gear down twice, and once I had to stop and get out and look at a puddle before I drove through it because I could not tell how deep it was. It was not deep. I made the cabin around 6:30, and by then it was full night. My headlights swept the front of the cabin as I pulled up, and there was the old shape of it, and the collapsed bunk shack behind it, and the cook shack pad. Nothing had changed. Nothing ever changes at that camp. I turned the truck around so it was pointing back down the 2-track, out of habit. My father taught me to always park facing out, because you never know when you might need to leave in a hurry, and it will save you a minute if you already turned around. I have parked facing out at that cabin for 31 years. That night, if I had not been parked facing out, I do not know what would have happened. Maybe nothing different, maybe everything different. I have thought about that a lot. I unloaded the truck. I brought in the cooler and the tote and the ammo and the rifle. I got the wood stove going. There was still dry cedar kindling in the box from the year before, and there was seasoned maple stacked outside under the eave that I had split in April, so the fire came up fast. I lit the propane lantern and hung it from the hook in the middle of the ceiling. The cabin got warm quick. It always does. It is a small space, and the stove is oversized for it. I ate a ham sandwich standing up. I drank a beer. I sat down at the table, and I looked at the topo map I always bring, even though I do not need it, and I planned the next morning. I was going to set up on a stand I had put in years ago on the edge of a cedar swamp about 3/4 of a mile northeast of the cabin. It is a good stand. It has produced deer for me maybe 8 or 9 times. I sat there with the map, and I listened to the fire, and I listened to the wind, and around 8 I turned off the lantern, and I got in the bunk and I slept. I want to say here that I did not sleep well, because I have thought back over that night many times, and I remember waking up more than once, and I remember thinking that the wind was doing something strange, but honestly, I did not sleep well the first night at that cabin very often. It is drafty, and the stove burns down after a couple of hours, and I am 53 years old and I do not sleep on a bunk very well anymore. I do not want to make more of it than it was. I woke up around 4:30, which is when I always wake up on opening morning, and I built the fire back up, and I made coffee on the top of the stove in a percolator, and I got dressed. I ate 2 hard-boiled eggs and a piece of bread. I put my orange on. I loaded the rifle. I went out to the truck and I drove about a half mile down a short spur to where I usually park for that stand, and I walked in from there in the dark with a headlamp on. I got in the stand about an hour before shooting light. That is normal. That is how I always do it. Nothing happened that morning. That is the first thing to say. I sat in the stand until about 10:30. I saw one doe, a small one, about 80 yards out. I saw a red squirrel who did what red squirrels do, which is scream at me for 20 minutes. I saw a flock of chickadees. I saw one raven who came in low over the cedars and cocked his head at me and left. It was cold, but not miserable cold, maybe 18 or 20 degrees, and the wind was down. It was a decent morning for sitting. Nothing walked past me that I wanted to shoot. That is the way opening morning goes maybe half the time. I have never been the sort of hunter who feels bad about coming out of the woods without a deer. I like the sitting. I walked back to the truck around 11. I drove back to the cabin. I made a sandwich and drank a Coke. I went out around 1:30 to set trail cameras, which is a thing I like to do the first afternoon, because it means I can check them the second day and get a sense of what has been moving. I hiked out to 4 different places I know within about a mile of the cabin. I set 2 cameras on a small oak flat where there is usually a scrape in November. I set one on the edge of the swamp about 200 yards from my stand. I set one on a game trail that comes out of a cedar tangle and cuts across a low ridge. I hiked back to the cabin about 4 in the afternoon. The light was already going. I built the fire back up. I ate an early supper. It got dark. I read for a while by the propane lantern. I called my wife from the porch because sometimes if you stand out on the porch and hold your phone up and to the west you can get 1 bar of signal, and I got through, and I told her I was fine, and she said the weather was going to move in Friday night, and I told her I would keep an eye on the sky. I went to bed around 9. Wednesday night was the first night I remember thinking something was odd, but even then, if you had asked me on Wednesday night, I would not have called it odd. I would have called it quiet. There is a normal amount of noise in that stretch of woods at night. There are owls, mostly barred owls, sometimes a great horned. There are coyotes, and every once in a while a pack up on the ridge above the creek. There are deer moving through, and their hooves crack the ground crust when it is frozen. There is the wind in the tops of the balsams, which sounds nothing like the wind in the tops of the hardwoods. There is in the distance, once in a great while, a wolf. There are wolves in the western UP now. I have heard them maybe 4 or 5 times in 20 years. That Wednesday night, from the time I went to bed until the time I got up, I did not hear a thing. Not a coyote, not an owl, not a deer, not a squirrel scratching in the eave. The wind was blowing, but the wind was the only thing. I remember lying there once around midnight thinking, it is quiet tonight, and then I rolled over and went back to sleep. Thursday morning I hunted a different stand, one about a mile southwest of the cabin, on a saddle between 2 ridges. It was colder than Wednesday, and the wind had swung around out of the north. I saw 2 does around 8 in the morning. I did not shoot. I have got a rule I made a long time ago that I do not shoot the first doe I see, because I always think there is a chance a buck is behind her. That morning there was no buck behind her. There was, about 15 minutes after the does moved past me, a coyote who came up out of the drainage below the ridge, walked right up the same trail the does had walked, and stopped about 40 yards from my stand and looked at me. I have had coyotes look at me before. Coyotes have good eyes and they figure out pretty fast that something is off in the trees, and they leave. This coyote looked at me, and then it looked over its shoulder, and then it looked at me again, and it turned around and it went back down the drainage the way it had come. It did not trot. It ran. That was the first thing I saw that stayed with me. I sat in the stand another 2 hours after that, and I did not see anything, not even a squirrel. When I climbed down at 11, I remember thinking that the woods had gone quiet again, and I remember thinking about that coyote, and thinking, I bet a bigger predator moved through here. I hiked back to the truck. I drove back to the cabin. I ate lunch. I checked the trail cameras that afternoon, or I tried to. I got to 3 of the 4 cameras with no trouble. The pictures were normal. I got a lot of squirrels and 1 doe and 1 raccoon. The 4th camera, the one I had set on the game trail on the low ridge, was on the ground, not knocked over, on the ground. The strap was still buckled around a jack pine about 8 feet up the trunk, but the camera itself was on the ground about 10 feet from the tree, face down in the moss. When I picked it up, the strap on the camera had been broken. It was a nylon strap, not the strongest thing in the world, but it was a fresh strap out of the package that morning. It had been sheared through, not chewed. When I looked at the tree, there were no claw marks on the bark. There was no bear scat. There were no other tracks I could make out on the frozen ground. I stood there for a minute with the broken camera in my hand, and I thought about it. I thought about a bear. Bears will sometimes bat at cameras, and I have found cameras on the ground before that a bear got into. But bears leave marks. They leave hair on the strap. They leave a print. There was nothing. I thought about a person, somebody hiking through, who had somehow bumped it hard enough to snap the strap. But you would have to hit it pretty hard to break that strap. And who would be hiking that ridge? It was 3/4 of a mile off the 2-track. There was no trail. I did not have an answer. I put the camera in my pack. I went back to the cabin. I put the camera on the table. I looked at the pictures. There were 9 pictures on the card. 7 of them were of nothing that I could see. Wind moving a branch, probably. 2 of them were taken about 10 minutes apart, at 2:47 in the morning on Thursday, and both of them were black. Not black like the camera failed to fire the flash. Black like something was standing right in front of the camera, blocking the whole frame. I put the camera down. I did not know what to think. Now, I want to be honest here, because I have had a long time to think about that afternoon. And if you had asked me right then what I thought had happened, I would have told you I probably set the camera badly, and something walked into it, maybe a deer, and knocked it off, and the 2 black frames were just an animal too close. That is what I told myself at the time. I put a fresh set of batteries in the camera and a fresh SD card, and I took it out the next morning and set it in a different spot on the same ridge. I did not lose sleep over it that night. Thursday night was not quiet. Thursday night was the opposite. There were coyotes just after sunset, close, maybe a 1/4 mile from the cabin, and they went at it for probably 20 minutes. They sounded like they were on something, or fighting each other over something. I have heard coyotes yipping like that before over a deer carcass. That is not unusual. What was unusual was that they stopped all at once. Not the way coyotes normally stop, where one falls off and then another, and finally you get one holdout who yips a couple more times to himself. They stopped as a group. 1 second they were going, and the next second they were not. And after they stopped, I did not hear another sound out of them, or out of anything else, for the rest of the night. I sat on the porch of the cabin for a minute after they stopped, listening. I remember I had my hand on the doorframe, and the wood was cold. I remember I had a beer in the other hand. I could not hear the wind. That is not exactly right. I could hear the wind if I concentrated, up in the very tops of the trees, but at ground level, everything was still. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes. I did not hear anything. I went inside and I latched the door. Friday morning I got up at 4:30 as usual. It had snowed a little overnight, maybe half an inch, dry powder on top of the crust. I went out to the truck to put my rifle in and my pack in, and I stopped in the yard with the headlamp on, and I looked at the ground. There were tracks in the fresh snow, not deer tracks, not coyote tracks, not bear tracks, and bears should have been asleep by then anyway. They were tracks I could not immediately identify. There were 4 of them clear, and a couple more that were partial where the snow had blown, and they ran along the edge of the cabin, not straight, but along the edge, about 6 feet from the wall, and they did not come toward the cabin, and they did not turn away from it. They just ran parallel to it. When I put my headlamp beam right on them, my first thought was that a large dog had come through the yard. My second thought was that there were no large dogs out there, because the nearest house was 14 miles away. I got down and I looked at one of the tracks close. It was the size of my palm, maybe a little bigger. It had 4 toes with claws. The pad was wide. The claws were long and set out ahead of the toes, not tight to them like a cat. It looked, more than anything, like a wolf track, and there are wolves out there. That is what I settled on right then. I told myself, a wolf came through the yard. I have never seen a wolf track at that camp before, but there are wolves, and it is not impossible, and it made sense. I stood up. I looked at the way the tracks ran along the cabin. I put my foot down next to one of them. My foot was longer, but the track was wider. I stood there for a minute. Then I got in the truck and I drove out to hunt. I hunted a stand I have on a bench above the creek that afternoon. I had planned to sit the same swamp stand from Wednesday, but I changed my mind that morning while I was drinking coffee. And I do not know why I changed my mind. I sometimes think about that. If I had sat the swamp stand that morning, I would have gone out the same way I came in, and I would not have taken the old logging spur, and I would not have driven the piece of road where the thing happened later. But I changed my mind. I went to the creek bench. I saw nothing all morning. Not a squirrel, not a bird. That was the 3rd morning in a row I had sat somewhere, and the woods had been quiet. I noticed it, but I did not think about it. Or I thought about it, and I told myself, the weather is going to change, and the animals are laid up. I hiked out of the stand at 11. I got back to the truck. I drove back toward the cabin. On the way, on the two-track about a half-mile from the cabin, I saw something in the road ahead of me. It was maybe 150 yards out, standing in the middle of the two-track. My first thought was, that is a deer. It was too tall for a coyote. It was about the height of a doe at the shoulder, maybe a little taller. But it was not the shape of a deer. The head was wrong, the neck was wrong, and the way it was standing was wrong. It was not standing broadside. It was standing straight down the road, facing me, with its head lowered. Deer do not stand facing you like that. They stand quartering, or broadside, and they look at you sideways because their eyes are on the sides of their heads. This thing was pointed straight at me, and it was not moving. I was in the truck. I had my foot on the brake. I was about 150 yards out. I picked up the binoculars off the passenger seat, and I brought them up. Before I could get them focused, it was gone. It did not walk off. It did not run. It went into the timber on the north side of the road, and it went in one motion. I heard the brush move, faintly, through the windshield. Then it was quiet. I sat there in the truck for probably a full minute, with my foot on the brake. Then I drove forward slowly. When I got to the spot where it had been standing, I stopped and I got out. There were tracks in the 2 inches of old snow on the two-track. There were 3 of them clear. They were the same tracks I had seen in the yard that morning. They were the same size, the same shape, the same claws set out ahead of the toes. They led off the road into the north side timber. I could see them go about 10 feet into the trees, and then they were gone into the crust where the snow had been blown thin. I stood there for a couple of minutes. I do not know exactly what I was thinking. I remember I was looking at the woods on the north side, and I remember the woods were dense there, second-growth balsam and cedar mixed in with some old rotted stumps from the original logging, and you could not see in more than about 20 feet. I remember I had my rifle in the back of the cab, in a soft case. I remember thinking, maybe I should get it out. I did not get it out. What I did was I got back in the truck. I drove to the cabin. I ate lunch. I did not tell myself out loud what I thought I had seen. I did not want to. That afternoon I sat around the cabin for a while. I read some of the paperback on top of the stack. I do not remember what it was. I remember I could not concentrate on it. Around 3, I decided I was going to go check the camera I had set that morning on the ridge, the replacement for the one I had found on the ground. It was about a mile hike from the cabin. I put my orange on. I put my pack on. I took the rifle out of the case and I loaded it. I had not carried the rifle loaded on a hike to a trail camera before. I have never gotten out of the truck at the camp without a rifle since. The hike went out fine. The camera was where I had left it. It had 11 pictures on it. 10 of them were nothing, wind and shadows. One of them was of a deer, a small buck, 4 points on one side and 3 on the other, walking through around noon. I did not stand there and go through the pictures right at the tree. I checked that the camera was still on and pointed right, and I hiked back. On the hike back is when I noticed something following me. I want to be careful how I say this, because at the time I did not know it was following me. I only knew that I could hear something in the trees off my right shoulder, moving in the same direction I was moving, keeping pace with me. It was not close. If I had to guess, I would say 60 or 70 yards off. 60 yards in that kind of timber, you cannot see anything at all, but you can hear it. If it is something big enough, and if you are quiet, you can hear it move. And I heard it. I would take 20 steps and stop. It would take a few more steps and stop. I would start walking. It would start walking. It was pacing me. I told myself at first that it might be a deer that had gotten curious. Deer do that once in a while. Or a coyote, though a coyote would not pace me for that long. I stopped and I turned and I looked into the timber to my right for as long as I could stand to look. I did not see anything. There was a slight breeze from the northwest, and once in a while a branch moved, and that could have been anything. But when I stood still, it stood still. When I moved, it moved. I got back to the cabin about 4. It was already getting toward last light. Whatever had been pacing me stopped, or I stopped hearing it, about 200 yards from the cabin. I do not remember any specific moment when it stopped. I remember I broke out of a stand of aspen, and I was on the last little ridge before the yard, and the yard was in front of me, and I realized I had not heard anything for a while. I did not go back and look. I got to the cabin. I put the rifle in the corner by the door with a round in the chamber and the safety on. I did not take the case off. I closed the door. I latched it. I checked that both windows were shut and locked. There is only one door on that cabin, and there are two windows, and one of the windows does not really close all the way anymore because the frame is warped. I stuffed a rag in the gap. I sat down at the table. I did not build the fire back up right away. I sat there with my coat on for a while, and I listened. I need to say something about the way I was thinking that night, because I have thought about it a lot since. I was not scared, exactly. I was not the kind of scared where you sit and shake. I was on edge. I was doing the thing you do when you are on a tree stand and you know an animal is close and you have not seen it yet. You listen with your whole body. You breathe through your mouth so your nose does not whistle. You do not move any more than you have to. I sat at the table like that for probably an hour before I finally got up and built the fire and lit the lantern and made myself eat a sandwich. I remember I did not really want the sandwich. I ate it anyway because I have hunted long enough to know that food is fuel, and you do not skip fuel just because your stomach is off. The night was not quiet, exactly, but the sounds were wrong. That is the best way I can put it. The wind was going, and the wind sounded normal, but I could hear branches breaking, once in a while, at a distance. Branches break in the woods. It is a windy night. It happens. But these were bigger sounds than that. They were the kind of sound you get when something walks through timber and shoulders a low branch out of the way, and the branch snaps back. I heard 3 of them in the first hour after full dark. One of them was close enough that I stood up. I stood next to the door with my hand on the rifle, and I listened. I did not hear anything else for a while. Around 8, I heard something walk across the porch. It was not a heavy walk. It was quick, 4 steps, maybe 5, and then nothing. I have had raccoons on that porch, and I have had a fisher on that porch one time, years ago. I have never had anything big on that porch. But this was not the sound of a raccoon. Raccoons make a scrabbling sound. Their nails are short, and they are low to the ground, and they do not walk in a straight line. This was the sound of a big animal walking, quickly, on a wooden porch. The sound went from left to right, from the side where the woodpile is to the side where the truck was parked. Then nothing. I stood next to the door for probably 10 minutes with the rifle in my hands. I did not hear it again. I looked out the window on the truck side, and I could see the truck in the moonlight, and I could not see anything by the truck. I did not open the door. I do not open the door of a cabin at night, in the middle of nowhere with a rifle in my hand for something I cannot see. That is how people shoot other people. I stood there for 10 minutes. Then I sat back down at the table, and I did not turn the lantern off until well after 10. I slept badly. I slept in my clothes with the rifle across the bunk against the wall. I woke up twice. The first time I woke up because I thought I heard something outside the wall by my head. It is a log wall, and I was on the top bunk, and the wall was maybe 2 feet from my ear. I heard, or thought I heard, a slow scratching, not a rat scratching, a slow, deliberate scratching, like a fingernail dragged down a piece of pine. I lay there for probably 5 minutes, and I did not hear it again. I told myself I had dreamed it. I probably had dreamed it. But once you have that in your head, you cannot get it out. The second time I woke up, it was close to 4 in the morning. I woke up because it was quiet. And I mean quiet the way it had been Wednesday. I could not hear the wind. I could not hear the stove ticking. The stove had gone out, and I could not hear the last of the coals shifting. Everything was still. I lay there. I did not move. I listened. After a while I heard, very far away, a coyote yip once. Just once. Then nothing else. I got up around 5, and I built the fire and I made coffee. I did not go out to hunt that morning. I sat in the cabin, and I drank coffee, and I looked at the map, and I made a decision. I decided I was going to pack up and leave a day early. The forecast that had come in before I left home had put the storm in on Sunday. My wife had said Friday night on the phone that the storm looked like it might come in Saturday now. If the storm came in Saturday, and I stayed until Sunday, I might not get out. That 2-track would be under a foot of wet snow, and I had once nearly not gotten out of there in a spring storm in 2013, and I had told myself then that I would not push my luck again. I told myself that was why I was leaving. That was part of why I was leaving. It was not all of why I was leaving. If I am honest, and I have thought about this many times, it was more that I did not want to spend another night in that cabin. I did not want to go out to hunt. I did not want to hike out to the trail cameras. I wanted to be in the truck, and I wanted to be moving. I packed the cabin down. I packed it more thoroughly than I usually do. I usually leave a few things because I know I am coming back the next year. I took everything. I took the propane lantern. I took the little transistor radio I keep on the shelf. I took the sleeping bag I had folded on the top bunk. I took the old paperbacks. I even took the coffee can of matches. I do not know exactly why I did that. I could not have told you at the time. I banked the stove down and I closed the damper and I checked that no coals were live. I walked around the cabin and I put my hand on the wood stove and the pipe. I stood in the middle of the room for a minute and I looked at the room. I loaded the truck. I loaded it quickly. It was probably 9 in the morning by the time I was ready to pull out. Before I got in the truck, I walked around it. I do not know why. I do not usually walk around the truck. I walked around it, and on the back bumper, on the driver's side, there were 3 long scratches in the paint. They started high on the tailgate, above the taillight, and they ran down at an angle to the bumper. They were not deep. They looked like a big cat had swiped the tailgate. There are no big cats up there. I stood behind the truck with my hand on the tailgate, and I looked at the scratches. I looked at the yard around the truck. There was no fresh snow that morning, and the ground was frozen crust, and I could not see any tracks near the truck. I did not have a way to make sense of the scratches. I stood there for probably 2 minutes. I got in the truck. I started it up. I put it in gear. I pulled out of the yard. The 2-track out of the camp runs east for about 100 yards and then bends south, and then it runs south for maybe a mile and a half before it hits the forest road. The whole 2-track is bad, but the piece from the cabin out to the bend is the worst piece. There are 3 low spots in there where the road holds water, and you have to pick your line, and you have to keep moving. I had done that piece 100 times. That morning I did it slower than usual. I do not know why I did it slower. I remember I was watching both sides of the road, and I was watching the mirrors. The dash camera was running. It runs whenever the truck is running, and I did not think about it that morning any more than I usually did. It was there. It was on. About a quarter mile down the 2-track, I saw movement in the mirror. Not clear movement. A shift. Something in the road behind me, out toward the edge, back where the road bent out of sight. I looked at it in the mirror, and I could not see anything. I looked away. I looked back. There was something back there. I could not tell what it was. It was too far, maybe 200 yards back. It was the color of the woods, and it was low, and I could not tell if it was in the road or on the shoulder. I sped up a little. I looked back in the mirror. It was still there. It was keeping the same distance. I sped up a little more. The road was bad enough that I could not go much above 15 miles an hour without risking the oil pan. I could not tell if it was matching my speed or if I had just gotten used to seeing it there. I hit a low spot, and I had to slow way down and grind through in low 4-wheel drive. And when I came out of the low spot and looked in the mirror, it was closer. Not much closer, but closer. I want to describe what I was seeing in the mirror as clearly as I can because I have watched it, in the mirror and later on the dash cam, more times than I would like. In the mirror, it was a shape. It was the color of wet brown leaves and old bark. It was low to the ground. It was moving in a way that was not quite a run and not quite a walk. It was moving fast for a walk, but it was not bounding the way a deer bounds, and it was not trotting the way a coyote trots. It was moving with its head low. I could see something like shoulders. I could not see legs clearly, because it was at the edge of what I could resolve in a mirror at that distance through the back window, with a dirty rear glass. But it was there. It was following. I picked up the Motorola off the console, and I keyed it, and I said, "Hello, anybody on this frequency? Over." I did not expect a response. There was nobody on that frequency. There was nobody within 20 miles of that frequency who was not on a state DNR channel or a private hunting camp channel, and none of them were on the one Wade and I use. I keyed it again. I said, "This is a hunter on Forest Road 9, if anybody has a copy." I let go of the button. There was nothing. There was a little squelch, and there was nothing. I picked up my phone. There was no signal. There is never a signal on that 2-track. I put the phone down. The road bent south. I took the bend faster than I should have taken it. The truck slid a little on the crust. I came out of the bend, and I looked in the mirror. For a second I did not see anything. Then as the road straightened, I saw it come around the bend behind me. It came around the bend without slowing down. It came around the bend the way a coyote comes around a bend, low and smooth. But it was not a coyote. It was too big. Even at 200 yards, in a mirror, through a dirty back window, I could see that it was too big. The shoulders were too high. The head was too big. I put my foot down as hard as I dared. The truck bounced. The tools in the toolbox in the bed clanged around. I hit a stretch of road that was pretty good for that road, maybe a straight quarter-mile with only one rough spot, and I got up to 30. I looked in the mirror. It was still there. It was not gaining on me anymore, but it was not falling back either. It was pacing the truck at 30 miles an hour on the two-track, at what I would guess was 150 yards. I have been asked since then by the 2 or 3 people I have told this to in full, whether I ever thought about stopping the truck and getting out and taking a shot. I have thought about that question. The answer is I never thought about that. I do not think it ever crossed my mind. I had a loaded rifle behind the seat. I am a decent shot. In another situation, if I had seen a big coyote or a wolf or even a bear pacing me at that distance, I might have thought about it. That morning I did not think about it. I wanted to be gone. I wanted the truck to be moving. I wanted the highway. I did not want anything else. The next low spot came up faster than I remembered. I hit the brakes. The truck slid. I got it stopped just short of the low spot, and I dropped it into low range, and I crawled through. On the far side of the low spot, when the truck was climbing out and I could not see behind me because the truck was nose up, I lost sight of it for maybe 10 seconds. When the truck leveled out and I could look in the mirror again, it was not on the road. I did not see it on the road. I looked hard. I looked at the timber. I could not see it in the timber. I did not slow down. I did not want to think about where it had gone. I told myself, maybe it turned off. Maybe it lost interest. I did not believe either of those things, but I told them to myself. About a quarter mile before the two-track hits the forest road, there is a piece of the two-track that runs alongside an old logging spur that goes off to the north. The spur has not been driven in probably 20 years, and it has grown up in balsam saplings, and it is not really a road anymore, but you can still see the cut. Where the spur takes off from the two-track, there is an opening in the timber that is maybe 40 yards wide and 60 yards deep, and I have shot 2 deer out of that opening from the truck when I was rolling through in years past, sitting in front of the wheel and taking a shot with the window down. I know that opening well. When I came up on that opening, I did not slow down. I was not slowing down for anything. I was going maybe 35, which was too fast for the road, and I was watching the mirrors. As I came alongside the opening, out of the corner of my eye, on the driver's side, in the opening, something moved. Not in the trees, in the opening, in the open 40 yards of ground. I turned my head. I should not have. I do not know why I turned my head. I turned my head, and I looked out the driver's window as the truck went past the opening. I do not want to describe what I saw at that moment as though I got a good look at it. I did not get a good look at it. What I saw was in the corner of the opening, closer to the timber than to the road, standing up. I want to be careful with that word. When I say it was standing up, I do not mean it was standing up like a man. I mean it was standing more upright than it should have been. Its shoulders were up, its head was up, its front, whatever you want to call the front, was off the ground. It was tall. That is the thing that has stayed with me the most. It was tall. If it had been on all fours, it would have been the size of a big dog. Standing up, it was as tall as a person, taller than a person. I saw it for less than a second. My truck was rolling past at 35 miles an hour, and the opening was maybe 60 feet long. My eyes went to it, and my eyes came off it. I looked back at the road. I did not look back at it. There was a spike in me, in my chest, in my hands. I could feel my hands sweating in my gloves. I made the forest road. I turned south onto the forest road. I put the truck into two-wheel high, and I opened it up. The forest road is gravel, and it is bumpy, but you can do 45 on it if you know it, and I know it. I did 50. I lost the back end once in a corner, and I got it back. I made the county road in 8 or 9 minutes, which is a run I have never done in less than 15. I hit the county road, and I turned west. The county road is not paved, but it is graded, and I got up to 65. I went past 2 hunting camps I know, and neither of them had anybody at them. I went past a state land parking lot, and there was 1 truck parked there, and I did not stop. I made M28 in about 20 minutes. I sat at the stop sign at M28 for probably a full minute. There was no traffic. There is never any traffic on M28 in the middle of a Saturday morning in November. I sat there with the engine running, and I looked in every mirror I had. I looked out every window. I did not see anything. There was nothing in the timber on either side of the county road behind me. There was nothing on the shoulder. There was nothing on the road. I sat there. My hands were shaking. I do not remember them shaking on the two-track. They started shaking at the stop sign. I pulled onto M28, and I turned east, and I drove 12 miles to Kenton, and I did not stop in Kenton, and I kept going. I drove all the way to Marquette without stopping. I got a room in Marquette that night at a Super 8 off the highway. I did not go back to the camp. I want to tell you about the dash camera now, because the dash camera is the one thing I have from all of this that is not just something I remember. I did not think about the dash camera on the drive to Marquette. I did not think about the dash camera on Sunday when I drove home. I thought about it Monday. I was in my garage Monday afternoon, unloading the last of the gear, and I saw the little red LED blinking on the mount on the windshield, and I thought about it. I pulled the SD card out of the camera. I took it inside. I put it in the reader on my computer. I sat there for a while before I opened the folder. I did not want to see what was on it, or, that is not right. I wanted to see. I did not want to see. Both of those. The dash camera records in 10-minute clips, and it labels them with the date and time. I scrolled to Saturday morning. There were a lot of clips. The camera runs whenever the truck runs, so there were clips from every drive I had made that week. I went to the ones from Saturday. The one I wanted was the one from around 9:10 in the morning, when I would have been coming down the two-track. I found it. I opened it. I watched it. The front camera is what I watched first. The front camera shows the road ahead of the truck. There is nothing on the front camera worth talking about for most of the clip. Trees, road, sky, the hood of the truck. About 4 minutes into the clip, in the front camera, when the truck is passing the opening on the driver's side, you can hear the truck. You cannot hear anything else because the front camera does not have a microphone that picks up anything outside the cab. In the front camera, at the moment I turned my head goes off screen for a second. You can see my shoulder move. Then you see me turn back. My face is only barely in the frame at the bottom, but you can see that I am looking at the road. You cannot see what I saw. The front camera does not see out the driver's window. I knew that. I did not think I would see anything from the front. I went to the rear camera. The rear camera is what has kept me up at night, and off and on for a long time. The rear camera mounts on the inside of the rear window. It is a small camera, and it looks through the back glass, which was dirty from the drive up. It shows the road behind the truck. The picture is not sharp. It is fine, but it is not what you would call sharp. On the two-track that morning, the rear camera picked up a lot. It picked up the road stretching out behind the truck. It picked up the timber on both sides. It picked up, once you know to look for it, the shape. The shape shows up about 2 minutes into the clip. It comes around the bend behind me exactly the way I remember. It is small in the frame because it is far away, but it is there. It follows for about a minute in the frame, matching the truck's speed. And then it goes into the timber on the north side of the road when the truck goes through the low spot, and it does not come back out of the timber for the next section of road. On the rear camera, when the truck rolls past the opening, you cannot see the opening because the rear camera is looking behind and the opening was ahead and to the side. But right after the truck passes the opening, in the rear camera, the shape comes out of the timber on the north side, and it steps into the road behind the truck for about 3 seconds before it goes off the edge of the frame because the truck is getting away from it. The shape is in the middle of the road, and it is standing there, and it is on 2 legs. That is the piece of video I have kept. That is the one that I could not delete when I deleted the rest. I have watched it maybe 100 times. I have showed it to 2 people. Wade is one of them. My wife is not one of them. I did not want to show her. Wade watched it once, sitting in my garage, and he watched it a second time, and he handed the phone back to me and he said, "That is not a bear." I said, "No." He said, "And it is not a person in a suit." I said, "No." He said, "What do you think it is?" I told him I did not know. Wade said, "I have heard of that. I have heard of that up there." I said, "What have you heard?" Wade told me a story about his uncle, who worked on a road crew in the 60s out of Watersmeet, and one of the crew, another Upper man whose name I do not remember, told them one night around a fire that when he was a boy his father would not let him out of the house after dark in November because there was a thing in the timber that ran on 2 legs. Wade said he called it something. He said his uncle did not remember what the man called it. He said his uncle had thought it was a story. I did not know the word for it until later. I did not go looking for the word for it. I do not want to sit at my kitchen table and look at message boards and read other people's accounts and try to fit what I saw into a name. I did not do that until about a year after. When I did, I found the word, and I found other accounts, and I found that there is a name that people use up there for a thing that runs on two legs in the deep timber, and that people have said they have seen for a long time. I do not want to write the name here. I know what the name is. Other people, if they read this, will know what the name is. I do not think naming a thing helps you understand it. I think it makes you feel better. I do not feel better about it. I did not go back to the camp for 4 years. I did not sell my rifle, and I did not sell my hunting gear, but I did not go to the UP. I hunted in the Manistee and the Lower Peninsula. My father would not have understood that. Wade understood it. When I finally went back, in year 5, I went back for one day, in the middle of the summer. I drove up with my cousin Randy, who was retired by then, and we drove out to the camp in his truck. The cabin was still standing. The bunk shack had fallen down completely. The scratches on the concrete pad of the cook shack that I had not noticed the November I left were still there. I had not seen them that November because there had been snow on the pad. Under the summer sun, the pad was clean, and there were 3 long marks in the concrete, going from one side to the other, and I did not know when they had been made. They could have been made any time. Concrete does not weather fast. My cousin looked at them and asked me what those were, and I told him I did not know. I did not tell him the story. I have never told the story to my cousin. He is not a man who would take it seriously, and I do not want to hear him tell me I was tired or I had a bad week. I have thought many times about whether I should have called somebody. I did not call the DNR. I did not tell the warden in Kenton. I did not tell Perry at the store. I told Wade. I told my wife, in a broken way, one night after a couple of beers, and I have not told her the whole story since. I did not tell my daughter. My daughter would tell me to go see somebody, and there is not anybody to go see about a thing like this. There is a specialist for a lot of things, but there is not a specialist for what I saw. I saw what I saw. I have the video. The video is not proof of anything. If I showed the video to a stranger, they would say it was a bear on its hind legs, or a person in a suit, or a low-quality image of nothing. I have watched the video enough times that I know what I am seeing in the video, and I know that whoever else watched it would not be seeing the same thing. I still hunt. I hunt other places. I hunt with people now. I do not go into the timber alone. I would not go back to that camp alone under any circumstance. In the year 2023, my wife asked me if I was going to sell the camp, which is a strange way to put it because I do not own the camp and never have. But I understood what she meant. I told her I did not know. I told her the cabin will fall down on its own within another 10 years, and I do not need to do anything about it. She said, "All right. That is how I have left it. The cabin will fall down. I do not have to go back." There is one thing I have not said, because I have not been sure whether to say it, and I have gone back and forth on whether it matters. When I got to Marquette that Saturday and I checked into the Super 8, I brought my gear into the room, all of it, because I did not want anything left in the truck. I laid the rifle on the bed and I unloaded it. I took my orange coat off and I hung it over the chair. I sat down on the edge of the bed, and I called my wife, and I told her I was in Marquette, and I was safe, and I would be home Sunday. She said, "Are you all right?" I told her I was tired. I told her I would tell her about it when I got home. I got off the phone. I sat there for a while. I got up and I went to the mirror on the wall by the door, because I wanted to wash my face, and there was a sink there. On the back of my orange coat, hanging over the chair, there were 3 long marks. Not tears, not rips. Marks, down the back of the coat, on the top layer of fabric, in a diagonal from the right shoulder to the left of the small of the back, there were 3 long, faint, discolored streaks. The coat was old. The coat had marks on it from a lot of things. I would not have noticed the marks if the light had not caught them a certain way. I stood there and I looked at them. I did not know when I had gotten them. I had not felt anything on my back at any point that day. I had not been in brush that would have snagged the coat. I had walked from the cabin to the truck in the morning, and I had gotten in the truck, and I had driven out. I threw the coat away in Grand Rapids on Monday. I did not want it in the house. I bought a new orange coat that fall. I still have that new coat. I have thought many times about the old coat, and about whether I should have kept it, whether I should have taken pictures of the marks and put them somewhere. I did not. I threw the coat in the dumpster behind the plant on my lunch break, and I closed the lid. The dash camera video is still on a hard drive in my desk. It is in a folder with a name that does not tell you what is in it. I do not know why I keep it. I do not intend to show it to anyone. Once every few years I open it and I watch it. I watched it again a couple of months ago. It is the same as it always was. The shape comes around the bend, and it paces me, and it goes into the timber, and it steps out onto the road behind the truck, and it stands there on two legs for 3 seconds, and then the truck pulls out of the frame, and it is not on the video anymore. The last time I watched it, I noticed a thing I had not noticed before. I do not think it matters. I do not think it is anything. But I want to write it down, because it is the sort of thing that keeps coming back to me. In the 3 seconds when the shape is standing in the road behind the truck, at the very end of the 3 seconds, right before the truck goes around a bend and takes the shape out of the frame, the shape turns its head. It turns its head slightly to the north, off the road, into the timber. It does not look at the truck, it looks off to the side. And in the same frame, a fraction of a second, before the video cuts to the next shot, something else moves at the edge of the timber on the north side, back behind where the shape is standing. Something else that is also standing up. I have watched that frame maybe 20 times. I cannot make out what it is. It could be a shadow. It could be a branch moving. It could be a trick of the compression, because the camera is not a high-quality camera and the light was flat that morning. It could be one of 100 things. I have not gone back, and I am not going to go back. Wade and I do not talk about it much anymore. Wade lost Marlene the year after. He has not hunted since. My cousin Randy still hunts, up by Escanaba, and once in a while he asks me if I want to come up and hunt his camp with him, and I say maybe next year. Maybe next year is what I say every year. I do not think there is going to be a next year. That is all right. I have had a lot of Novembers. I know how this sounds. I know how it reads on a page. I have thought about how it reads, because I have written it down in a notebook once before, and then I tore the pages out and burned them in the wood stove at home, because I did not want anybody to find them after I was gone and think their father or their grandfather had lost his mind at the end. I have written it down again now, on a computer, and I do not know what I am going to do with it. Maybe I will not do anything with it. Maybe I will leave it on the desktop for a while and then I will move it to the same folder as the video, and it will sit there. Maybe I will delete it. I have not decided. The last thing I will say, and then I am done with this, is that ever since that November, when I am driving at night on any road that has timber on both sides of it, I look at the mirrors more often than I used to. I do not look at them because I am worried about traffic. I look at them because it is a habit I picked up on the 2-track that morning, and I have not been able to break it. Once in a great while, I will be driving on a 2-lane road at night, and I will look in the rearview mirror, and for a fraction of a second I will think that there is something in the road behind me, low and quick, moving with its head down. It is never anything. It is a shadow, or the way the light hits the road, or a deer at the shoulder that I only half see. I know it is nothing, but my eyes go there first. My eyes always go there first. I do not think they are going to stop. I locked the truck that night at the Super 8 in Marquette, and I brought all the gear inside. In the morning before I checked out, I went out to the truck to load it, and I walked around the truck once, the way I had walked around it at the cabin. The 3 scratches on the tailgate were still there. In the light of the parking lot on a Sunday morning in November, with the sun just coming up behind the motel and the traffic starting to move on the highway across the lot. They did not look like anything special. They looked like scratches on a truck. I ran my finger down one of them. It was not deep. I could feel the ridges where the paint had been lifted. I stood there for a minute. Then I put the gear in the truck, and I got in the driver's seat, and I pulled onto the highway, and I drove home.